Welcome back. Today we're talking about forms of participation in politics that do not include voting, so basically everything else you're supposed to do as a good citizen of this great nation of ours. That said, let's talk about Garcia Rios. What are they talking about here? This one was, I'll be honest, not my favorite writing style for an academic paper. It's kind of dense, but we can get through it together. What are they arguing? Yeah, so basically they argue that authoritarian or punitive interactions, authoritarian not in the sense that like you're dealing with Vladimir Putin, but authoritarian as in the sense that you're dealing with authority. Interactions, so like talking about interacting with the police or with the welfare state or probation systems, can either demobilize citizens from engaging with politics or actually prompt them to engage with politics, depending on how people interpret those experiences. And that interpretation is really contingent on group identity. So basically, when individuals feel that that discrimination is targeting their group rather than just themselves, then they feel politically connected to that group, and in turn, it will foster political participation. And they come up with some fancy terms about this. They basically transition the notion of individual personal justice, right? Like, I commit a crime, I go to jail, to this idea of collective justice. And when you have a sense of collective justice versus collective injustice, that then can mobilize groups. Basically, they say that politicized identities condition responses to state power. If you're looking for a good definition of what they view as politicized identity, that's on page 993 of the paper itself, kind of in the first column, most of the way down the page. Basically, it's an identity or group of people that have a sense that the state is continuously antagonistic towards their group. Basically, the sense that, hey, the police are pulling us over a lot more than they're pulling over everybody else. That is a politicized identity. Basically, they look at Black, Latino, and Asian individuals and view that in some groups more than others, predominantly Blacks and Latinos, identity is more salient as a figure in prompting group mobilization than in others. That's kind of what this figure here is showing. And finally, remember when I talked about policy feedback a few weeks ago? The traditional view of policy feedback theory suggests that authoritarian policies, again interacting with authority, reduce participation by eroding the public's view of the government as trustworthy or efficient or effective. Basically, these people come in, these authors, and they revise that view of things, and they show that policy affects basically the end stage of that policy feedback loop, producing the policies, are mediated more by race and group consciousness than we had thought about before. For example, marginalized communities contact with authoritarian groups signals collective disadvantage in a highly visible way, which then does the opposite of the traditional policy feedback view and actually prompts people to then engage with the policy process rather than prompting them to say, oh, you know what, this sucks, I'm not going to engage with this. Which, to me, that's kind of shocking that it takes until 2023 for the literature to catch up to this clear thing that we've known about since forever. Like, what was the civil rights movement if not a bunch of people being really upset about their treatment and being mobilized to political action? What was the entirety of the gains of civil rights during Reconstruction, if not this same thing? What was our revolution, if not this, viewing Americans as a group of people being repressed by an authoritarian state? And I do mean authoritarian in your common understanding of that term in that case. Little paper, I'm probably not going to pull anything from this for the exam, I'm going to be honest. This one's a little, but still a fun paper. It's still a fun paper. I know none of you read it, but, you know, if you feel like reading it, go back and do it. So let's talk about participation beyond voting. Today we're moving beyond voting to explore the myriad other ways that citizens act politically. Participation can, of course, take the form of protesting, volunteering, community organizing, campaign work, and all of these in turn shape democracy just as much, and I would argue, if not more so, than voting does. So let's start at a baseline here. Let's define political participation. Political participation encompasses the full spectrum of citizens' efforts to influence governance. Anything that you do trying to impact the government, that's political participation. It can be direct, such as contacting a public official, or indirect. That could be donating to a cause or joining a protest or a demonstration. Scholars, of course, distinguish between these different forms of participation as conventional and unconventional participation. Conventional participation is voting, campaigning, petitioning the government, and unconventional participation could be through protests, boycotts, and strikes. Think about it as one of them being within the bounds of what government expects you to do, and one of them is slightly inconveniencing the government by acting unexpectedly. Each of these expresses political will differently, and they each serve a different function and get a different reaction from the system. But they all contribute to the legitimacy of democratic systems by signaling public engagement and constraint on power. Protests, believe it or not, can help legitimize a government simply by showing how they respond to those protests. Often, it is very delegitimizing for a government to disrupt protests violently versus just responding to them by saying, oh, they have some points and we'll talk about this in an open dialogue and move on. What I would not advise all of you if you go into politics is to create an AI video of you flying a fighter jet wearing a crown and dropping a bunch of feces on your enemies. That generally would be viewed as bad politics. We're going to go back to Mann-Kerr-Olson real quick because I'm sure you all have forgotten what that was about, but you all read a little bit of it. Mann-Kerr-Olson's logic of collective action remains foundational not just when we talk about the foundations of political behavior, but also when we're talking about political action. Olson shows that rational individuals face incentives not to participate in producing collective goods, like having clean air to breathe, or good political reform that just greases the wheels of bureaucracy to make it work better for all of us. Basically, because these rights and benefits are non-excludable. This creates something that he calls a free rider problem. So if we're all pushing for clean air, everybody here is pushing for clean air, and we all want that clean air to breathe, and Kyle decides, you know what, I'm just going to sit back and not do anything to push for clean air. He still gets the benefits of breathing clean air that for all the hard work that all of us have done. Sorry, I didn't mean to point you out there, but I'm still waiting to hear Bon Jovi's grandpa name. Successful mobilization depends on these things called selective incentives. And those are private rewards or sanctions that motivate contribution. Basically, the idea that you need to feel some kind of individual benefit directly from a collective benefit. Can't be abstracted like, oh, we all get this sense of blah, 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 blah. It's got to be like, I need $2 more in my pocket, or I need to have my asthma get better because I can breathe clean air. That's something that I feel individually. And of course, large groups struggle most when we're talking about collective action and motivation and politics, and small organized groups mobilize much more effectively. This is just intuitive in my head. More people means more problems. Less people means you got fewer opinions to deal with. The civic voluntarism model reframes participation through resources rather than this idea that as a baseline people are apathetic and have to be rewarded, right? It asks not, why don't people care about this thing, but rather, why can't they participate? It takes a much broader view of why people can't actually engage in politics when they might otherwise want to. Political activity, of course, requires time to engage, money to contribute, and civic skills like ability to navigate networks or collect information about something to navigate. It's the same kind of as voting, right? I talked about that cost-benefit analysis. Motivation for an individual as well as a group, as well as recruitment, determine whether these resources that exist out there translate into action. If I'm sitting at home and my life is pretty good, but I have a bunch of resources, I'm not going to be as motivated to go out and do something to change the politics of the world because I'm happy with the status quo as someone else who is living in desperate poverty might, but they don't have the resources to go do that. So there is a measure of empathy there that we need in order to allow these individuals that would benefit from this some degree of baseline resources to then carry out civic volunteerism. And of course, social networks, such as churches, unions, or workplaces, serve as mobilizing structures. I want you guys to note here that there is a requirement for capacity. That is your inherent resources, time, willingness, motivation, as well as invitation. Believe it or not, people generally don't want to be a part of a group that seems antagonistic towards them. It helps to get people on your side if you are welcoming to them and say, hey guys, come on in. There's a place for you here. There's a burgeoning literature coming out about the 2024 election and disaffected young white men, and how the Republican Party platform in that particular election allowed them to have a place that they could feel more comfortable being however they want to be than they would feel in another group. And this is kind of just an image that illustrates this theory. Participation often begins with just asking someone to participate. Social networks serve as conduits for this mobilization. Social networks being through your friend groups, through your coworkers, through, if you are religious, your religious groups. Those are the standard 3 examples that people say. Also family we'll put in there, but let's be honest, most people's families are rather divisive politically. Networks reduce informational costs, for example, where to go, what to do, and provide reassurance through social proof that you're actually getting together and doing something. If you show up to a protest and there's 2 other people, you're going to feel incredibly awkward. If you show up to a protest and there are 60 other people, that's more of a crowd and you're going to feel more free to protest as you see fit. That's kind of a snowball effect that happens with political engagement. The scholar Marc Granovetter, I could be mispronouncing that, maybe it's French, Granovetter, he has this concept of weak ties. And that's that casual relationships between people, just the everyday interactions you might have with them. You have a coworker who's a friendly acquaintance, but would you ever want to hang out with them and grab a drink with them? Probably not. Me, I'm a casual acquaintance, a weak tie, as this scholar would say. Those are more important, he says, for political engagement than your deeply held connections for a myriad of reasons. For example, if you have a friend group and you're the friend who's always talking about politics, you're probably going to stop being invited to things unless your friend group is like really insufferable. Like all of my grad student friend groups that I have where we all study politics and we are insufferable. But you get what I'm saying, right? If you have these casual connections, it can be like, hey, Jim at the water cooler, there's this event here. Let's talk about politics a little bit because there's low cost to that. Who cares if you piss off Jim at the water cooler? I mean, he might go to HR, but they don't care. Trust and shared identity are critical when it comes to mobilizing. People will act when they feel a part of something larger than themselves, as well as something legitimate. It can't just be an idea that, like, we're going to get together and say this thing and it feels very flimsy or whatever. The more official things feel, the more likely people are to engage with them. So let's go back to conventional and unconventional participation to really hammer this home, because there's probably going to be questions about it on an exam. When institutional channels fail to reflect the public's demands for things, citizens then turn to unconventional forms of action. So we have protests and direct action. Those communicate a sense of urgency and disaffection with the current status quo and the current systems where we can talk about our own issues and complaints. These acts are often expressive. They assert a moral or group identity. Think about people protesting Roe v. Wade, not the overturn of Roe v. Wade, but protesting Roe v. Wade itself. They are a very moralistic protest. But they also serve instrumental goals by shifting agendas and signaling legitimacy crises. This is what the Supreme Court is facing right now. This continued protest that they see outside of the Supreme Court is really harming their legitimacy because there is no other way for citizens to voice their aggravation with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supposed to be the highest appeals court in the land. There's nowhere to go after that. And if the Supreme Court is not hearing our complaints, where do you go but to the street? Democratic viability depends on both forms of participation. Conventional acts stabilize representation. Again, act when the status quo is amenable to your goals. And unconventional acts renew it through disruption. Disruption is sometimes necessary. Remember when we talked about civil rights and Martin Luther King. Now, as with voting, this lecture mirrors that very closely, there is a resource motivation gap. Political activity reflects a dual gap between resources and motivation. High socioeconomic status correlates with time, education, and civic confidence, informational knowledge about how the system works and where you can go to voice things. Traits like that facilitate engagement, like voting. Political efficacy, or one's belief in one's ability to make a difference, mediates whether resources translate into action. If you don't believe in yourself, if you don't believe what you're doing is actually going to matter, why are you going to go out there and do anything? If you think, well, you know, the bastards never listen to us anyway, but I guess I'm going to go out there with my post and that's not going to result in anything. It's going to diminish motivation with the group as well. And structural inequalities, such as unequal access to organizations or information, amplify these differences. It creates a stratification, not just economically, but in how people's voices get heard in a democracy. Social movement theory emphasizes that protests are strategic and not spontaneous. Protests are a thought-out action. So when you hear news talk about, oh, these rioters or these crazy people, that's not what protests are. They are a strategic act that is planned out even if they seem disruptive and disorganized. The point is disruption. Collective identity binds participants to a shared cause while framing interprets grievances in politically resonant terms. For example, civil rights sounds pretty good. You want to be on the side of civil rights. That's successful framing. Climate justice sounds pretty good to latch onto. You want justice, right? You don't want injustice. Success depends on political opportunity structures, and those are the openness of elites and institutions to challenge, how open they are to hearing your complaints. A good example of this is when certain groups time challenges to laws that they see as unconstitutional in the courts. Aggrieved parties will often not bring a case that they know will go to the Supreme Court up during a term when they believe they have an unfavorable Supreme Court. For instance, right now, why would any progressive cause try to challenge a law that they see as unconstitutional with a 6-3 conservative majority on the court? They're not going to get anywhere. And finally, movements not only demand policy change, but they expand the boundaries of political inclusion. And they redefine who participates and what, on what terms. Movements lead to representation too. This is what I'm trying to get at. I was trying to get at with the discussion last class too. You get representation not just by what you do in the ballot box, but by also how you appear in public, whether you're going to demonstrations, whether you're donating to causes, whether you're going out there and volunteering. Those can lead to representation too. This is an image from the Tea Party protests of the early 2010s. So digital platforms democratize participation by reducing costs. Sharing petitions, donating, or organizing events takes seconds now. But these low-cost acts can dilute impact if they substitute for deeper engagement. This is called slacktivism. It can also produce echo chambers where people think that they're making a difference, but they're all just talking to the same 5 people who already agree with them. Or maybe the same 5 million people who already agree with them. Online spaces can also amplify polarization through algorithmic reinforcement. How many of you have been scrolling through TikTok, or if you're old, Instagram Reels, or if you're really old, YouTube Shorts, and you like pause for a little bit too long on some like political wacko, and then the next thing you know, you have nothing but a feed full of people telling you that seed oils are going to kill you and raw milk is the way to go? Like, that happens, right? You get trapped in those rabbit holes. Then you have to like readjust your algorithm by stopping on everything you like for a really long time. And yeah, it's the same thing, but it actually is poisoning your brain and making you see content that is gearing you towards polarized poles of the political spectrum. Like online gambling, social media is also bad for your brain. Still, digital participation enables rapid mobilization and global reach. I don't know if I super believe that, but seen in movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and this illustrates how technology can be used as a successful tool for political mobilization. This is a somewhat outdated view. In the mid-2010s, particularly the early 2010s, during the Obama administration, there was this idea with a lot of technocrats. Elon Musk, when he was still on seemingly the left side of things, was really pushing for this, that this is gonna, and Mark Zuckerberg, social media is going to democratize social movements across the world and connect all of us and get people to overthrow authoritarian regimes. But the thing that the Obama administration stupidly didn't recognize was that these are companies and they are governed by capitalistic intentions, and so their goal and duties are to shareholders and not to the general public weal. So again, social media, it's not as good of a tool as the somewhat outdated political science literature might suggest. Participation is power to a degree. Governments respond more consistently to active organized groups than they do to single citizens trying to reach out to them. The literature shows that policymakers are more attuned to the preferences of affluent and mobilized constituents than they are to the general public. Now, affluent and mobilized can be used synonymously here because it's hard for poor people to get mobilized. And additionally, we've already talked about elections are expensive, so they're going to listen to, where their bread is buttered. This inequality in input produces inequality in output. Policies reflecting the active rather than the average. So basically, when we have inequality in who is using their voice and speaking up, you're going to have inequality in what policy looks like. It's going to represent who is active and who is loud much more than it is going to represent the average citizen. Expanding participation is both a normative and practical challenge then. It, in essence, determines the fairness of democratic responsiveness in our system. This is Bernie Sanders speaking in Washington at the No Kings rally before 200,000 people and looking like he's about to fall over in the wind. Surprise, it all comes back to institutions. Institutions set the stage for participation. Laws protecting speech and assembly, those can foster activism. We know of a few of them. They're in the Constitution, which you've all read ad nauseum. Restriction of speech and assembly obviously represses it. Civil society organizations and political parties provide structured channels for engagement, converting private grievances into more visible collective demands. See, parties, they're not all bad. They're not quite as bad as online gambling might be, but I'm just on a kick with that now. They can be good too. Parties give people a space where they can belong and come together and say, okay, what platform, what issues are we going to try to bring to the attention of those in power, and we're going to bring them up to the top. When institutions are open and responsive, citizens can engage constructively. When they're closed, contention between the public and the government intensifies. Participation and the kinds, conventional versus unconventional, can also be kind of a thermometer that reflects the health of the institutional environment. If you're seeing a lot of unconventional engagement with the political system, that shows that there's probably not a very healthy political system operating, because those conventional channels are not robust enough to accommodate the kind of change that people want. Engagement in politics cultivates skills among the public, it can reinforce trust, and it embeds citizens within communities of shared purpose. By that I mean, when you are activated into some form of politics, when you first take a step onto the stage of politics, that sticks with you, and it helps you develop a community, networks, people to talk to about these issues, and then that spreads, and so on and so forth, until you develop these kinds of group identities that Garcia Rios and friends are talking about in that paper that I assigned today. Through participation, individuals become visible to power, but also to one another. I think when we were talking about democracy last class in the discussion, there's kind of this misunderstanding that democracy is just about having your voice heard by those in power. That's not so. Democracy is also being able to identify voices you agree with and disagree with at a horizontal level, at a lateral level, among the public. Sustained engagement keeps democracy adaptive, accountable, and legitimate. So, big takeaways here. I am going to get you out of here early. Political participation encompasses a spectrum of acts that define democratic life. The theories that we discussed show that engagement depends on resources, incentives, and mobilization networks, predominantly in order to enact political participation. Participation both reveals and can reproduce inequality over time, but it also offers the means to challenge that inequality if used correctly. Essentially, democracies thrive not just when citizens vote, but also when they organize, deliberate, and act together in the pursuit of collective goals.